Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Wolfson College, and welcome also to those online who will be watching this lecture on our website. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Christopher Kelly to give this year's Syme Lecture, established in memory of the great Roman historian and classicist Ronald Syme, Fellow of this college. Professor Kelly is Professor of Classics and Ancient History at Cambridge University. He's also been Master of Corpus Christi College since 2018. Professor Kelly was an undergraduate at the University of Sydney, where he read law and history. He was a graduate at Trinity, Cambridge. His doctoral thesis there was entitled Corruption and Bureaucracy in the Later Roman Empire. He became a research fellow at Pembroke and then a fellow at Corpus from 1994. He was, I think, at one time president of the Cambridge Union Society. His interests in the ancient world are wide-ranging: government and power, its use and abuse, the society, religion and culture of the Roman Empire from Augustus to Justinian, the rise of Christianity, Edward Gibbon and the Grand Tour. He was an editor of the Cambridge Classical Journal from 2000 to 2006 and is currently editor of the Journal of Roman Studies. So, Christopher, the floor is yours.
To begin with, a nightmare. And no ordinary bad dream, but a near-death phantasmagoria. Or at least so it was imagined by Jerome, one of the most impressive Christian intellectuals and biblical exegetes of the 4th century. Writing in Rome in 384 to the aristocratic teenager Julia Eustochium, who following her mother's ascetic calling had vowed herself to a life of virginity, Jerome recalled a time when he had immersed himself in his own library of Latin classics, reading and rereading Cicero. One night, driven to exhaustion by fasting and solitary prayer, Jerome had a vision of himself arraigned before God's heavenly judgment seat. Asked what religion I professed, I replied, "I am a Christian." But he who presided said, "You lie. You are a Ciceronian, not a Christian." Jerome was dragged away and whipped until he cried out, begging for mercy, "Lord, if ever again I possess worldly books or read them, then I have denied you. What has Horace to do with the Psalms, Virgil with the Gospels, Cicero with Paul?" Run forward 10 years to one of the most discussed epistolary breakups in late antiquity, the demise of a long-standing friendship between two poets and two Christians, Ausonius of Bordeaux and Paulinus of Nola. Ausonius ranks as one of the most inventive of 4th century poets, whose extensive output with its clear debt to his classical predecessors encompassed poems praising the river Mosel, describing the daily round on his estate, and displaying his technical virtuosity, for example, in ending every line with a monosyllable. Paulinus was taught by Ausonius in Bordeaux. Following a successful senatorial career, which included a provincial governorship, he announced his rejection of the world and moved to Nola in Campania, using his wealth to beautify the martyr shrine of Felix, write poetry in praise of the saint, and preside as bishop. At the center of the literary falling out of teacher and former pupil is a poem in which Paulinus defined his revolutionary Christian practice against Ausonius's traditional poetics. Hearts dedicated to Christ reject the Latin muses and exclude Apollo. Of old you and I shared common cause. Our zeal was equal, if our poetic resources were not, in summoning deaf Apollo from his cave at Delphi. But now another power, a greater God, inspires my mind and demands another way of life. Ausonius's response, mediating on amor, amicitia, pietas, and officium, love, friendship, respect, and duty, is a courteous exemplar of performative rebuttal. Its web of classical allusion, tracking across many of the same authors that had underpinned Paulinus's poem, aimed to counter the division between one poet trapped in an old world and another who claimed to have broken free and opened the way to a new Christian poetry. To quote Ausonius, "For my trust is assured, and my reverence for that Paulinus of old is always unchangeable." Modern commentators, of course, have been quick to point out that Paulinus's poetry is itself a virtuoso display of which his teacher would be proud. The poems written in Nola are anchored in traditional forms. Each year in January, from 396 to 407, amidst the splendid mosaics and sparkling fountains of the saint's shrine, Paulinus publicly performed a Natalicium, a birthday ode for Felix. In their subject matter, these were Christian poems, to be sure, but these beautifully wrought hexameter verses were also masterpieces of densely elusive poetics, saturated with Horace, Lucretius, Ovid, and Virgil. Jerome, too, was unable to hold fast to his own dictates. His letters followed well-established and recognizable classical epistolographic templates. His reading and his repeated quotation of classical poets, especially Horace and Virgil, shaped his thinking. In 394, 10 years after his dream narrative, Jerome responded to a sharp rebuke from the orator Flavius Magnus. "Why do you besmirch the whiteness of the church with pagan excrement?" Jerome offered a defense of his literary and intellectual practice grounded in biblical authority. A key text was Deuteronomy 21, verses 10 to 13, which allowed a victorious Israelite to marry a captive maiden, provided that she shall shave her head and pare her nails. At last Jerome could admit the attractions of classical literature. Quote, "Why is it odd if I too, because of the allure of her speech and the beauty of her person, should not desire to turn pagan wisdom from a captive maiden into an Israelite? Shorn of her idolatry, delight, error, and lust, their union in Jerome's imagination would result in vernaculi, slaves born in the master's household, vernaculi for the Lord. My work profits Christ's household. My mating with an outsider adds to the number of my fellow servants." Paulinus took a similar line, though without the tortured erotic charge, in his poem and accompanying letter to the learned Jovius, likely written around 400. Glancing at Exodus 3, verse 22, which permitted Israelites to adorn their children with the spoils of Egypt, he encouraged his friend to write Christian verses. Again evident are the sharp-edged contrasts with which a decade earlier Paulinus had tried to flame Ausonius. Quote, "Let it be enough for you to take from them the resources of their language and the flamboyance of their speech, like spoils seized from enemy forces. This is the grease paint of eloquence, which now needs to take account of the fullness of truth." These attempts to explain, or to explain away, a close and productive engagement with the classical past are best understood as strategies for marking out territory in a complex and unsettling debate. At its core was Christianity's own exaggerated narrative of triumph, which forcibly interrupted the long continuity of the classical world, dividing its history between a pre-Christian past and a Christian present, most fully realized with the conversion of Constantine. That sense of distance deepened across the 4th century as Constantine's reign receded and the Christian present lengthened. By the turn of the century, no one could credibly claim to remember the empire before Constantine. No doubt, most educated Christians in the 4th century could formulate an account of the differences between pagan superstition and Christian truth. At the very least, they could recycle the powerfully overdrawn rhetoric of opposition which animated contemporary church history and shapes hundreds of surviving late antique sermons. Of course, these carefully contrived contrasts, as all good sermons should, chafed against everyday habits and assumptions. They were also key in the invention of paganism as a derogatory Christian label which sought to create and vilify a single religious community where none in fact resisted. As Neil McGlynn has wisely remarked in a characteristically rich and rewarding essay on paganism, and I quote, "Christians invented paganism solely to measure it against their own religion. Preachers kept it alive as a useful bogey, but its principal function was to suffer defeat." Overheated polemic aside, it must have been obvious to contemporaries that educated Christians continued to prize classical literature and delight in artful allusion and witty quotation. Jerome and Paulinus' anxieties suggest some rules of engagement. At stake was whether late antique readers and writers could quarantine themselves, not only from nighttime fears of idolatry, delight, error, and lust, but also from the intertwined themes of empire, non-Christian religion, and Romanitas, which ran seemingly indelibly through the poetry of Horace, Lucretius, Ovid, and especially Virgil. Simply put, in contention was whether classical literature could ever successfully be disengaged from the classical past. For educated persons in the 4th century, classical culture remained key in marking out membership of the empire's ruling class. The classical canon remained the bedrock of the school curriculum. Save in the tightly enclosed world of monasteries, Christian communities never developed or even contemplated an alternative Christian education system, whether at primary or secondary level. Paideia, Greek for education and a handy catch-all for classical culture, was a conspicuous and easily identifiable badge of belonging. Paideia provided a recognizable backdrop for those in the know to the comfortable exercise of power and advantage, and a shared body of knowledge, much of it hard run by rote at school, that underwrote a privileged sense of elite solidarity and superiority. This, I think, helps to explain why, in stark contrast to other societies that have undergone a major religious transformation, participation in late Roman government, from municipal councils to membership of the Senate, was not subject to any formal confessional declaration. Given the centrality of Paideia to the empire's elite, it's difficult to see how any test act concerned with classical cultural education could ever have been put into effect. This should serve as a gentle warning to readers of 4th and 5th century texts that they should be wary of any simple correspondence between classical culture and paganism. Of course, late antique Christianity is dominated by standout narratives of renunciation. Renunciation of the world, renunciation of the classical past, renunciation of an individual's previous life. But these highly charged rejections should not be taken as expressions of some agreed or certain view of holiness or Christian identity. Rather, like the invention of the artificial catch-all of paganism itself, they are dramatic interventions in a fierce and unresolved dispute about what it meant to be Christian. These same concerns haunted Jerome's dreams and fractured the friendship between Paulinus and Ausonius. But however black and white some contemporary claims, it's not a matter of taking sides or of crudely dividing late antiquity into pagan and Christian. Engagement with classical culture is not some convenient benchmark which allows modern critics to calibrate an author's commitment to their faith. For Christians such as Paulinus, Ausonius, or Jerome, a concern with the past framed a wider debate about what it meant to be a Christian in an empire whose educated elites were still held fast by paideia. Around 380, 6 years after his disturbing nightmare, and then in Constantinople, Jerome completed a Latin translation and supplement to the chronological tables of Eusebius of Caesarea, best known as the church historian and biographer of the Emperor Constantine. Eusebius's chronological tables trace the rise and fall of 19 Mediterranean states year by year across 24 centuries, from the birth of Abraham to the beginning of the 4th century AD. The methodology was elegantly simple. Eusebius first established a running series of dates using 3 main chronological systems: years since the birth of Abraham, Olympiads from 776 BC, and the regnal years of various states and empires. These formed the framework of the tables, occupying the marginal columns of each page. The remaining interstitial space briefly noted important events. As time progressed and Mediterranean history became ever more complex, so the number of parallel timelines increased. Strikingly, the chronological tables exploited the visual and technological possibilities of the Codex book. The reader moves through the past by turning the pages. It's important to emphasize that this project would simply not work on a papyrus roll. On each double spread, Eusebius set secular events, the most crowded display 10 parallel columns, against a chronological spine established by the Old Testament and then Roman history. Simply put, Eusebius is the first historian known to have constructed a universal synchronic world history which simultaneously displayed notable events and comparative chronology in tabular form. At a glance across the parallel columns, running like railway tracks down the page, a reader could align significant moments in the history of Christianity with a wide range of other cultures: Assyrian, Persian, Egyptian, Hebrew, Athenian, Spartan, Corinthian, Sicyonian, Argive, Lydian, Macedonian, Hellenistic, Latin, and Roman. The handout offers a snapshot of the chronological tables in Jerome's Latin translation for the years 836 to 850 after Abraham. The decades are enumerated on the far left of the page. Then the parallel columns to coordinate Assyrian, Hebrew, Sicyonian, Athenian, Latin, and Egyptian history. The Latin column in the middle of the right-hand page runs hot with incident: Aeneas' arrival in Italy after the sack of Troy, his reign and that of his son Ascanius, who founds Alba Longa, and lastly the fabulous tales which Eusebius dismisses of Odysseus' voyage home. All this in turn to be coordinated with Old Testament events in the middle on the left-hand side. So it's very helpful to be reminded that at the same time Odysseus was making his way back to Penelope, another darker love story was unfolding just across the page, that of Samson, the Hebrew Hercules, and Delilah. Jerome specified that for ease of reading, ideally different coloured inks should be used, a nicety of design which sadly I have not been able to reproduce in the handout. Within the grid of the chronological tables, human history in its entirety could be summarized. From the birth of Abraham to the 20th year of Constantine's reign, AD 325 in our dating system, Eusebius reckoned 2,000 342 years. According to this version of the past, Moses brought the Israelites out of Egypt 505 years after the birth of Abraham, 7 years after Deucalion's son Hellen had founded the Greek race. Icarus flew too near the sun 735 years after the birth of Abraham, that is, 3 years after the death of the Old Testament judge Deborah, while 12 years later the Argo sailed on its quest for the Golden Fleece. The labours of Hercules could be securely dated. Homer and Hesiod are pegged to the 20th year of Solomon's reign, and as we've seen, Odysseus and Samson were contemporaries. Jerome's Latin translation and extension to AD 379 of Eusebius's chronological tables had a profound impact on Christian views of the past. Augustine of Hippo, arguably one of the cleverest people in antiquity, closely consulted his own copy while writing City of God. Composed across a long decade in the early 5th century, City of God Against the Pagans is the largest work coherently organized around a single theme to survive from antiquity. Across 22 books, or in modern terminology chapters, most of about 12,000 words, Augustine set out a philosophical, theological, pastoral, and exegetical program whose impressive breadth was intended to rival the classical encyclopedic tradition. The opening sections of Book 18 of City of God transform Eusebius's chronological tables into prose. Augustine first offers a biblical history synchronized against the rulers of Babylon and Assyria, the first great world empire, and then moves to the classical past, which is both ordered and disoriented by repeated reference to the Old Testament. This also provides a framework for placing in historical time men and women later mistakenly worshipped as gods. Serapis, Isis, Minerva, Mercury, Vulcan, Dionysus, Hercules, and Saturn. Tellingly, as in the slice of the chronological tables in your handout, a very brief space is allotted to Aeneas. To quote Augustine's retelling, "At this time, after Troy was captured and razed, Aeneas with 20 ships, which transported the Trojan survivors, came to Italy, when Latinus reigned there, and Mnestheus was king over the Athenians, Polyphides over the Ciconians, Tartanes over the Assyrians, and Labdon was judge over the Hebrews. Then after Latinus died, Aeneas ruled for 3 years, while the same kings continued in the places listed above, save that Pelasgus was now ruler of the Ciconians, and Samson, judge of the Hebrews." Here, the whole of Virgil's Aeneid is compressed into 2 sentences whose synchronized king lists crowd out the beginnings of Roman history and mark its belatedness. After all, on Eusebius's reckoning, when the city of Rome was founded by Romulus, the Hebrews had already been in Israel 718 years. In contrast to the chronological tables, where time proceeds steadily down each page, Augustine's narrative surges forward to emphasize the difference between its parallel chronologies. The expansion of the Roman Empire is glossed in a handful of lines. Only Pompey's capture of Jerusalem, 63 BC by modern reckoning, is related in any detail. The Emperor Augustus is reduced to a placeholder for the birth of Christ. While Herod was ruling in Judea, and after a change in the way the state was governed, Caesar Augustus was emperor over the Romans, Christ was born. Augustine's weighted history of the world, like Eusebius's chronological tables, aim to reshape both Rome's past and its future. Particularly striking is Augustine's approach to Virgil's Aeneid, a core text of the classical curriculum, which gave powerful poetic voice to a privileged Roman destiny promised by the gods. In that sense, it's convenient to think of Virgil as a kind of Rudyard Kipling for the Romans. Famous and frequently quoted are lines from Book 6. The hero Aeneas visits his father Anchises in the underworld. Hae tibi erunt artes, pacisque imponere morem, parcere subiectis et delibare superbos. Romans, your arts are to be these: to pacify and impose the rule of law, to spare the conquered and battle down the proud. Augustine remains unmoved by Virgil's inspiring mission statement. These are, in his views, the puffed-up fantasies of a proud spirit, and in any case not supported by the historical record. Taken together, Sallust and Virgil, as presented by Augustine, supported a view of Roman history as driven by a love of fame, a quest for glory, and a desire for domination. Set in the matrix of a world history, given structure and order by the Old Testament narrative, and made visible on the codex page of the chronological tables, the Roman Empire could at last be seen in its proper perspective. Rome's rise as the second world power after Assyria-Babylon was part of God's unfolding providential plan. Any claim to Roman exceptionalism, as celebrated in the Aeneid, can now be written out of history. Not all Christians would have affirmed Augustine's approach to the classical past. City of God should never be cited as if it represented some settled Christian consensus. Orosius's history against the pagans, undertaken at the request of Augustine and completed in 418, when the City of God was still only half written, offers a version of the Roman imperial past which pivots on a key chronological coincidence: Christ and the Emperor Augustus. As noted above, this was a synchronism hurriedly passed over by Augustine. It was not emphasized by Eusebius, for whom the inflection point in Roman history was the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by Vespasian in AD 70. According to Orosius, Christ was born in the year when Augustus, by God's design, had established the most durable and genuine peace. In the same year, Augustus, whom God in his great mysteries had chosen, ordered a census to be held. In a remarkable anachronism which pulls forward provincial enfranchisement by 2 centuries, Orosius enrolls Christ as a Roman citizen. I quote, "Nor can there be any doubt that our Lord Jesus Christ advanced that city to its greatest height, a city which with his ascent had expanded and been defended, most strongly desiring when he came both to belong to it and to be called a Roman citizen, as declared by the Roman census." For Augustine, this association of Augustus and Christ and empire risked the enjambment of Roman and Christian history, which the City of God had worked carefully to avoid, and Orosius embraced. It also lent renewed prophetic authority and inspiration to the other famous contemporary of Christ and Augustus, Virgil. Augustine was aware of Christian readings of Virgil, especially Eclogue 4, with its apocalyptic themes and messianic promise of an unnamed child whose birth would restore the world to a lost golden age of innocence. This was part of a wider interpretive project which aimed, in the words of Faltonia Betitia Proba, one of the few women writers in late antiquity whose work survives, to read Christianity into Virgil, or perhaps to read Virgil's Christianity, and I quote, "Be present, God. Lift up my mind, and I will show that Virgil sang of the holy gifts of Christ." Writing in the mid-4th century, Proba's preferred literary form was a canto, a technically challenging undertaking which disarticulates existing texts and reconstructs them in new ways. Proba disassembled Virgil's hexameter verses and recombined them in a 694-line poem on biblical themes: the creation, the fall, the flood, the life and passion of Christ. It's as though one set out to write a poem in praise of Wolfson College, celebrating its 50th anniversary on the Cherwell, using only lines and half-lines from Milton's Paradise Lost, or perhaps more diplomatically, Paradise Regained. The handout briefly displays Prober's poetic technique, presenting two examples of the repositioning of lines from the Aeneid, here restored, if that's the right word, to their Virgilian context. In the first example, lines originally uttered by King Latinus are given to God after Christ's baptism. In the second, Christ himself voices lines originally written for Neptune. In this sense, the canto can usefully be thought of as offering a reading both of its underlying text, which it disassembles, and of the narrative, which it reconstructs, but asymmetrically. Virgil does not tell the Bible story, and more importantly, it's the scriptural narrative that gives the canto its coherence. This is a tension which the canto is unable to resolve. After all, as the texts on the handout unapologetically expose, the more knowledgeable reader, well versed in Virgil, is best placed both to applaud the bravura accomplishment of the canto and to work against it by moving to restore the fragments to their original context. With all this cleverness, Jerome was utterly unimpressed. In a letter written around 394 to Paulinus of Nola, he complained that the ingenious facility with classical literature on display in the canto was, I quote, childish, rather like the circle shows of a street performer. This was a poetic parlour game, best left in Jerome's view to the too talkative old lady, perhaps a crude swipe at Proba herself, best left to the crazy old man and the gauche windbag. It's unlikely that Jerome's concern was the classical verse form. He'd found space in his supplement to Eusebius's chronological tables to include a brief note on the early 4th century poet Juvencus, whose retelling of the gospel story in epic hexameters was full of Virgilian flourishes. Rather, Jerome's objection was that the Christian writers and readers of cantos might mistakenly believe that they had unlocked an inner truth in Virgil, now revealed in Jerome's phrase, sine Christo Christianus, a Christian without Christ. At its core, this was a willful misreading of Virgil. It was not, as the preface to the Emperor Arcadius' copy claimed, Morone mutatem in melius, Virgil changed for the better. For Jerome, Prober's extreme poetics too abruptly pushed the classical past into a Christian present. Classical texts and their authors should not be transformed into Christian exemplars avant la lettre. This is another useful reminder that in late antiquity there was no agreed Christian approach to reading classical texts or to interpreting the classical past. Rather, there was a set of contrasting and sometimes sharply conflicting positions. It's also worth noting that these views were advanced by highly educated writers, Jerome, Paulinus, Augustus, Orosius, Ausonius, Proba, who would all have regarded themselves as Christians. For Jerome this was, and perhaps understandably, the stuff of nightmares. Educated Christians in the 4th century walked a religious and cultural cliff edge. At stake, as Avel Cameron clear-sightedly observed in her groundbreaking Syme Lectures in 1986, was a dispute over the right to interpret the past. From one point of view, an intimate engagement with the classical canon by readers and writers of sophisticated poetry and prose was as expected as it was unremarkable. For Christians like Proba, attempts to Christianize the classical past, particularly to read literary heroes such as Virgil as sine Christo Christianus, were thoughtful responses to the advance of a new religion which had inevitably deformed the classical past. After all, the Christian dispensation pivoted on the incarnation which had happened in undeniably very Roman historical time. On the other hand, the New Testament narrative, yoked to the Hebrew scriptures, held out the possibility of tracing a golden thread of divine providence back as far as Abraham or even to the flood and the fall of Adam. Against this cosmic backdrop, the history of Rome, its possession of empire, and its claims to divine favour could properly be assessed. For Augustine in the City of God, Rome was to be marginalised, enfolded in a world history which, like the columns in Eusebius's chronological tables, was defined and held firmly in place by the succession of biblical events. For Orosius, the striking coincidence of Christ and Augustus was an indication that the Roman imperial story might still be privileged. At stake for these positions and their variants was the contested and difficult matter of cutting the classical past and its text loose from the often undeniable and intrusive beliefs which had animated them. In short, Christian writers faced the difficulty of both recognizing the authority of the classical past implied in the very act of quotation or allusion, while marking out a critical and religious difference. The charming story is told that once upon a time in the 6th century, Pope Gregory the Great was walking through the Forum in Rome when he saw carved in stone an image of the Emperor Trajan securing justice for a defenseless widow. Moved by the sight, Gregory returned to St. Peter's, weeping and praying for the forgiveness of Trajan's sins and that he should find salvation in heaven. After some time, the Almighty answered, "I have heard your prayer, and I grant forgiveness to Trajan, but you should never again pray to me on behalf of a pagan." Many Christians in late antiquity would have agreed with God. No matter how distinguished the intercessor, heaven is not for pagans. It was precisely the polemical policing of the gap between the advances of contemporary Christianity and earlier non-Christian times which allowed a providential narrative of the rise of Christianity and the heroization of the early church and its martyrs to be written. It was precisely in this space that militant Christians could triumph loudly over pagans. And it is precisely in this space that was narrowed by the Christianization of the classical past, by the making of Christians without Christ. Much late antique literature hangs on that paradox. It's the unease at the heart of Jerome's nightmare. What has Horace to do with the Psalms, Virgil with the Gospels, Cicero with Paul? In the rift with Ausonius, it lies behind Paulinus of Nola's insistence on inspiration. Hearts dedicated to Christ reject the Latin muses and exclude Apollo. It helps to explain Augustine's disquieting fascination with Virgil's poetry. It strictly limited the number of non-Christian Roman emperors who could posthumously be prayed into heaven. Most importantly, these tensions provoked a broad range of contested approaches to Roman history and a series of disagreements amongst Christians over how key literary texts should be read and their intellectual and poetic resources exploited. As I've set out to explore this evening, these anxieties were neither fully nor satisfactorily resolved in the time of Jerome or Paulinus or Augustine, whose thought worlds were still shaped or perhaps better disrupted or deformed by a continued engagement with antiquity. Arguably then, it would take a world more securely Christianized than the 4th and early 5th centuries, and even further distant from the Mediterranean dominance of Rome, before the classical past could be deconsecrated, finally stripped of its religious sensibilities, and at last securely and safely converted to cultural heritage. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. So what a wonderful talk, and I think there probably is a little bit of time for questions if people have any. We do have a gentleman up here with a microphone, so is there anyone who would like to ask the first question? Gentleman down here.
Hello. I was wondering how this would affect people who are the new elites who are not educated in classical paideia, namely, the so-called barbarians, the new coming, the Franks, the Goths, the Vandals, who entered the Roman world but have less or little to no background in this classical paideia, and how reception of this new ongoing Christian tension would affect these new communities that's becoming increasingly dominant in the post-Roman world.
Thank you. That's a lovely question. I have to take, I think, a step back and say that you might possibly be subject to a contemporary vision of the barbarian as hairy and uneducated. But when we look at some of the cultural productions of the barbarian kingdoms, and I might point you towards some of the most elusive and complex Latin poetry that's written by poets in 5th century Vandal Africa, that there's a remarkable sense in which a lot of this culture and paideia is adopted by the incoming barbarians. And even when I say adopted, that may be to misstep. It may be a misstep to think that the barbarians come into the Roman Empire completely innocent of many Roman ways and of Roman culture. Certainly the Goths had been converted to Christianity in the middle of the 4th century, and as you know, the wrong sort of Christianity, Arian Christianity, which generated a series of tensions in the 5th century. But I think that gap between the educated Roman and the uneducated barbarian is in part a polemical product of the process of the formation of the post-Roman kingdoms.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I was just wondering how you would fit sort of the Hellenic or the Greek side of things into this picture, and I guess relatedly, the act of translation, from Eusebius into Jerome, from Homer into Virgil into Proba, and of course the Bible itself in that sense. So whether the East fits in.
Right, so a series of small, quick questions. Might be useful to start by thinking of a couple of key differences, I think. I think that in the Latin West, it's difficult to, or in the contrast between Greek and Latin, it's difficult to find a Greek text that carries the political weight of Virgil's Aeneid. And I think that makes quite a difference to the way in which, for example, Augustine's City of God can construct or avoid the way that he wishes to tell the story of the privileged, or push against the story of the privileged rise of Roman imperialism. There's a particular story about Eusebius's chronological tables, which is worth dwelling on for a moment. Although I've stressed the impact that it had, particularly through Augustine, on the thought world of Christianity, it's also the case that no Greek manuscripts of Eusebius's chronological tables survive. There's Jerome's Latin translation, and then there's a series of ghastly complexities as one wanders off into Armenian and other possibilities. So I think that reflects not a rejection of the chronological tradition in the East at all, but a particular choice by Eusebius. You'll notice that I said this evening that the chronological table started dating years from Abraham. I mean, in other words, like many chronographers before and after him in the East, Eusebius deliberately rejected what was one of the major aims of chronography, which was to discover the age of the world, which was to push the chronologies back to creation. Eusebius, very interestingly, believes that history starts with Abraham, which is something that deserves a talk on its own as a position to take. Why do you want to calculate the age of the world? Well, because of the various numerologies in the Old Testament. Remember the measurements for Noah's Ark, or if you want to build Solomon's Temple. Once you know accurately the age of the world, you can predict more accurately the coming of the apocalypse. And Eusebius takes this project out of that, and it has successes in the East, but I don't think that it has the same kind of impact that it has in the West as a result of Jerome's translation and updating. What would I do with the various Greek Kento projects of the Empress Eudokia, for example, or translations between the East and the West? I think that depends very much on a tactical decision that the late antique historian has to make as to when you're going to really see some clear division between the East and the West, and where you should pitch that. One might pitch that with Theodosius II. It sort of connects to the fragmentation of the post-Roman West. My sense is that the Greek East has its own story, which is rooted in largely a second sophistic approach to the Roman Empire. I mean, that is an approach to the Roman Empire in the writing of history that has always sought to question and undermine imperialism, and that means that there's a particular set of different connections about thinking of the pre-Christian history or pre-Constantine history. So I think it's weighted in the end differently in the West than the East. I stayed in the West because I only had 40 minutes, but it's also because I wanted to capture the connection between Eusebius, Jerome, its impact on Augustine's City of God, and then back through Probus Center. I wanted to unpick that particular nexus, which, as I said, I think has often been wrongly framed. So that was a non-answer to a set of very important questions.
You do have one right back.
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. Can I push again on the Greek side?
Please.
What do you think Jerome would have made of Basil of Caesarea's Ad Elescentes, Basil of Caesarea's own defence of classical literature, and which bits, as it were, one could hang on to, which one couldn't? Would he have been horrified by this? Would he have seen it as a different approach? There seem to be differences between the two approaches. Does that mean that then we can't talk about a Christian response to classical literature, but we need to think about either a Latin and a Greek, or maybe even just a personal response, that Jerome's attitude to this was different from Basil of Caesarea's?
Basil of Caesarea, in the middle of the 4th century, writes a small pamphlet, perhaps for his nephews, on how they should read classical literature. And it ends with 2 or 3 worked crits as to how one might interpret different and difficult passages from Homer. So, for example, he concentrates on the moment when the beautiful Nausicaa and her maidens are bathing by a stream before they're alarmed by a brine-encrusted naked Odysseus leaping out from behind a bush. No problem, says Basil, a Christian reading is available. You might immediately think that Odysseus was naked, but you've forgotten that he was clothed in the garments of righteousness. Problem. Jerome would find that intellectually facile, but I think that what he would be in tune with, which is what I think put him out of sorts with Proba, is that in Basil's approach to literature, there's no attempt to Christianize Homer. I mean, there's as it were a frank admission that this is a foreign text with a different belief system, and how is it that Christians should negotiate that? One sees, however, both in Basil and Jerome, which would have been, had Tim given me another 40 minutes, right? What I would like to have talked about was the way in which both Jerome and Basil use a set of intellectual techniques which they have honed in biblical exegesis. Right? There are lots of sticky and difficult passages in the Old Testament where patriarchs do things that are not clearly righteous or moral. And so that both Jerome and Basil, as biblical exegetes, are skilled in working these passages round for moral edification. And there's a lot of work, I think, that's still to be done in terms of thinking about how late antique readers, those embedded in Paideia, use the same kind of exegetical and interpretive methods and machinery for reading classical texts, which they're also using for making sense of the Old Testament. And also, in terms of the project as I presented it, that's right at the center of Christian exegetical thinking in terms of the book. That is, how does one reconcile the Old and the New Testament? That hunting back in the Old Testament for prefigurements of Christ, for example. Again, I think it's, as I said before, it's about a different kind of track that runs in the East. And what strikes me, and I may misstep here, and I'd be grateful to sort of be led back on the path, but I really do have a sense that the central dominance of Virgil's Aeneid to the Western classical tradition doesn't quite have its similar weighted equivalent in the East. And as I said before, that's partly because Greek literature has a whole story of writing cleverly about Roman imperialism, whereas Virgil's Aeneid is a much more straightforward, is a bad word to use in relation to Virgil because it's so sophisticated, but it is at base designed to show that the Roman Empire has a privileged place in history.
I think we probably have reached the end point of our conversation, so thank you very much indeed. Wonderful, Christopher, for your help. And just, let's say thank you.
Thank
you. And as you know, with the Syme Lecture, we're always delighted to invite all the audience to drinks afterwards. So in the buttery, drinks are served now. Welcome.